to have Professor Julian Williams, who is the Executive Director of Durham's Institute of Hazard, Risk and Resilience, and he'll be talking to us about the problem of investment in combating climate change and the tyranny of discount rates. But I've subsequently realised after he explained it all to me that the subtext is something like, why we're all doomed. So stay tuned because you need to know, right? For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Carly Beckerman. I'm a co-director in IHRR, and I'm the chair for this highly informative and slightly terrifying talk. And my job today is to question, challenge, and generally interrupt Julian to demand more examples and fewer academic terms. You're welcome. And then we'll open up for like a figurative, open up the figurative floor for Q&A at the end. And so I think we can just get stuck in. If everyone sort of trickles in later, that's fair enough. And so I'd like to start, Julian, by asking you, I understand you've been investigating this problem of investment for a long time now. So can I just ask you to talk us through where that came from? What inspired you?
Yeah, thank you. I think the key starting point for me was early on in my doctoral training studies. I was sponsored by a European Commission project, which was coordinated by two very high-profile sort of ecologists mostly, but they actually went a lot into economics. Fred Wolf and Lawrence Mee, who both unfortunately passed away quite recently. And they were very much focused on long-run trends, particularly in terms of mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Mostly focused on Africa, Eastern Europe, and sort of parts of Asia. And we spent a lot of time understanding and learning about how that, what was going to happen. And we did the sort of the first tranche and runs of scenario planning off of the IPCC, who were at that point relatively early in delivery of their work. And we started to take the scenarios and actually apply them regionally at more sort of detailed levels to look at impacts on different communities and things like this. And I think that was sort of the starting point for me. Then I went up to Aberdeen, and I became the co-director of the Aberdeen Centre for Resource Economics and Energy and Finance. And my good friend, Joe Straczynski, again, who passed away last year, there seems to be a commonality, was an environmental economist. And I would say most of the conceptual stuff that I'm going to think about, discuss today is based around conversations with Lawrence, Fred, and Joe over 20 years. And, I just would hope to sort of pay good respects to passing on the knowledge that they've passed on to me, amongst other people. There's many other people who I've discussed these sorts of things with, but they've been sort of the key influences on where I've been coming from in that area.
And haven't you also designed an MA on this topic?
Yes, we have. We've got a master's program that's going to be starting in climate finance. That's going to happen in, hopefully in September. I think it's pretty much certain now for September. And it's going to be focusing mostly on climate finance. That's going to be one part of it. There's a broader sustainability program, which is there, but a lot of the content that's sort of here is sort of developed out of building for that program, and also on the kind of work that we've been looking at sort of building over about the last 5 years in preparation for delivery of this. So hopefully it's going to be sort of a useful thing, and we're going to have a cohort of people who are going to be interested in this area. And climate finance is kind of important now, and we can discuss that a bit later on. But it's becoming a really key part of the sector. And we saw this morning several large institutions sort of coming out now and saying that they're going to be sort of having a strong focus on green finance and that sort of ways. I think what I'm going to talk a little bit here, that's the optimistic side of things, and also talk a little bit about sort of the slightly less optimistic side of things, because we're seeing issues that are coming out from how we're sort of going to pay for it at a large macro level. because the investments required at the moment are huge. And this is something that's necessary for both mitigation and attempting to sort of reduce the impact by reducing carbon emissions, and the adaptation, which is kind of where I've been a bit more specialized in, which is about how you create more resilient societies that will withstand potential climate hazards over the next 50 to 100 years.
Okay, so you've kind of jumped ahead a little bit of yourself there, because you made the monumental mistake of putting timings on your slides, which
yes, indeed,
it's a great decision. But so if you go back to the beginning a little bit, because what's popping up on the screen, and kind of explain to us what the core problem is, what's the issue?
Well, the issue obviously is that we have climate change. It's real. It's present, and it's possibly very likely to be much more immediate than maybe is deep into the public consciousness. I find this slide is always one of the ones, is my go-to slide whenever I'm sort of talking to insurance people, for example, and there's a discussion about what's the range of possible outcomes that could happen with climate change. And they say, well, this is 65 million years of global temperatures. And we can see where we are at the moment, which is right down in that bottom right-hand corner. And where we have what they call the PETM, the Paleocene Thermal Maximum, which is more or less about as hot as it can possibly get, even if we have super terrible outcome. And that range of temperatures is the sort of, that's the range of things that the environment has shown us that can happen over time, mostly correlated to different levels of carbon emissions and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Obviously noting that carbon dioxide is not the most important greenhouse gas, as it were. Water vapor is actually much more important, but that's to do with carbon dioxide in terms of feedback mechanisms. And I know there are colleagues of ours in geography who would give really, really good, quite technical descriptions about how all those sorts of things work. But from a sort of a financial point of view, if we're trying to work out the scenarios that we've got, what we have is effectively, this range that we have here, with more or less decreasing probabilities towards the top end. I mean, it's unlikely that we would get something like the Paleocene Thermal Maximum in the next 50 years or so. Although there are some very well respected earth scientists out there who say it's not impossible. And the impact on society, the impact on the ability of the earth to carry its human population and ecological population, animals, plants, biodiversity, will be quite extreme. And the question then comes in is, how do we go about investing? Because it's not something that's going to change if we don't make a decision. We actually have to make a proactive decision to do something about it. And that proactive decision actually results in a financial cost. And what we really want to do is understand, how much do we really need to spend? How are we going to spend it? And how much sacrifice we're going to have to make in terms of the spend now in order to actually deliver us to outcomes that we think are going to be better. And as I said, that's split into two parts. One is reducing the actual carbon emissions themselves, investing in decarbonization. And the second part is actually in the adaptation component, where we increase the resilience of communities, coastal communities that can be exposed to drought, ensuring that we've invested in soil science. And we had a discussion with our fantastic colleague, Karen Johnson, a while ago about soils. These sorts of things are important for us to understand how we actually increase the resilience of communities. So, this is the IPCC current chart that they've got in terms of the projections out of the relationship between, carbon dioxide emissions and surface temperature. And, we're just sort of walking up this trend, really. And, we're seeing ourselves move towards higher and higher temperatures. And those higher and higher temperatures will have, a good number of impacts on us as a society and how we actually live. And, just the general principles about what it is to live on the planet and how we interact in our everyday activity. And, economists have this sort of terrible term, we call it consumption. So how does that affect your consumption, and how does it affect your your children's consumption and their ability to sort of have good high social standards, welfare, poverty alleviation, and hitting things like our sustainable development goals. So we want to invest time and effort in reducing and alleviating poverty, increasing biodiversity, and these sorts of things. And at the same time, we're fighting against this trend of climate change, making it more difficult. So it kind of reminds me of a computer game that's gradually getting more and more difficult over time. And if we put more and more effort into it, it gets more difficult as the climate change component actually increases that level of difficulty. And we see more disasters. Obviously we're in Institute for Hazard, Risk and Resilience, and one of our key areas is disaster risk reduction. And we see more disasters, we see more issues that are happening to communities around, and more vulnerabilities that are there. And I think that's something which is going to be increasingly driven and trended with climate change over time. And maybe 10, 15 years ago we could have said, well, it's noise, maybe it's just some oscillations and things like that. And now we're actually seeing the signal arising, we're seeing the climate change signal coming out. And so we see that this is something that's important.
I like that the title of this slide is climate change is very real. I like that it starts like that. So is this something that economists or economic debates isn't quite grasping or isn't integrating well yet?
Yeah.
I'm asking you to diss your colleagues, naturally.
Economics, from where I came from, is quite a cold discipline. We have very hot arguments, but the key sort of features of how we set about those arguments are driven by cost-benefit analysis. And cost-benefit analysis is our sort of gold standard way of looking at things. And when I was originally coming up with the idea of doing a talk like this, I really wanted to go into the sort of the nitty-gritty of cost-benefit analysis, particularly cost-benefit analysis with high levels of uncertainty going forward. And then I realized that it's so cold and so distant from what it means to have a cost. And in this case, the cost is going to be the sort of the economic impact across people. But that's actually turning out in terms of how many people will suffer from these the consequences of this and how we value those consequences. And that does seem to be a quite a sort of a cold way of looking at things. And I fear that the discussion and the debate that we've had in economics over the last 25 years or 30 years even has really reduced climate change investment down to a very small number of parameters, effectively. And some of those parameters are quite sort of nebulous, like, how much are people willing to sacrifice in terms of what's the social cost of carbon? And, one of the things that we'll talk about later on, what is the discount rate that we apply to future outcomes and future costs? And this is quite as I said, this is quite a cold way of looking at things. But as somebody who, a good friend of mine who works in the finance industry says, in the end, you have to convince finance people, you have to convince those who are doing the valuations that they should change their asset allocations, or you have to convince central banks to change the way in which they're sort of allocating central bank funds, or governments in terms of fiscal policy and how they're changing taxation to make those investments. And that's increasingly difficult. And I think one of the UN climate finance and sort of the ambitions within climate finance that's reported by the UN gives you numbers which are so disconnected from the numbers that you see published, particularly by governments, that it gets me a little bit scared. I actually get a little bit frightened about whether we're actually heading in the right direction and whether we're making those sort of right changes in.
What do you mean, the difference between the UN numbers and the numbers published by governments? I don't understand.
It's the orders of magnitude. So, for example, the United Nations is suggesting that infrastructure, just infrastructure investment alone, needed roughly towards the next 10 years is going to be around about 93 trillion, between 87 and 93 trillion dollars. So We'll talk about $90 trillion is a number. Obviously, this number, they come up with sort of 87 and 93. I mean, it could be any number really in a range, but it's of that magnitude. Now, just to give you an idea of how much that is, nominal GDP of the world is about 90 trillion. And so that means that we need to spend on just infrastructure alone. Sorry, I'm getting myself in the mix up. Nominal GDP at the moment in the world is about 87 to 93 trillion. We need to spend 90 trillion. So that means we need to spend one time global nominal GDP on infrastructure by itself. And the UN says that if you spend that, you will get $4 to $1 back. So if you spend, for every dollar that you're spending on infrastructure, you're going to get $4 back, which is a good rate of return, but over a very long period of time. And the problem that you've got is that that's a huge amount of money to spend. And if we go on the UK government, for example, their climate change web pages and things like that, they're promising things like, 5 billion, 7 billion, these sorts of numbers are the numbers that are going to be spent, on climate change within the UK. And they're running up to numbers in the sort of regions of 20 to 30 billion. And that's just not even in the same ballpark as what the UN is suggesting needs to be spent overall. And the UK is a relatively small country, but it's still one of the bigger economic contributors to global GDP. And so we're not even close to the level of investment that we need in order to actually deliver the kind of robust infrastructure that's going to both reduce the level of carbon emissions and increase resilience of communities. And the question then sort of comes back is, well, if we know roughly that that's how much we need to spend, it's like, why aren't we spending more now? And because, if there's a relatively good rate of return, why are we why have we underinvested, and why have we historically underinvesting in these particular items? And I think that's the sort of the major question that I wanted to ask myself, and that's a question I've been asking myself for sort of 15 years, which is why are we always underinvesting in climate change? And the numbers that are reported by government seem to be quite big, and people can sort of say, well, look, they're investing a lot of money, but it's not even close to what's estimated as the necessary spend. And it's not that spend is dropped down the sink, it doesn't just disappear. You will get a return back on that investment. And the question then just comes in is how do we actually sort of motivate that a bit more? So that's sort of where my quandary comes in, and I think that's where sort of the key question that pops out, and the answer, I think, is in discounting. It's something that came up around the Stern Review, and I think that's been the big issue.
Okay, well, before you launch into the tyranny of discount rates, what actually needs investing in? Because you've mentioned mitigation and adaptation. Like, how are you defining those for this?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. And so we start off with mitigation. We can think about effectively reduction in carbon emissions. It's obviously, in the UK, we've picked most of the low-hanging fruit. So our carbon emissions have plateaued and then begun to drop. A lot of that's to do with switching out from coal to gas, and that's been a relatively straightforward, and actually is cheaper. We've also then moved to having a lot more electricity generated by renewables, particularly offshore wind and solar, and that's a relatively straightforward. Now we sort of get on to the more complicated tasks of doing things like changing gas boilers to run off of, say, hydrogen, or to switch over more to electricity. And that's a much bigger task, and that requires a huge amount of investment. And the last talk in this series will talk a lot more about that as a particular problem. So in just for the UK, that would be something where we would be looking at, changing our economy to a lower carbon economy. It's also then looking down the supply chain, so going out to countries like China, for example, where there's more coal in the mix, and trying to get a reduction in carbon emissions from there. Same in the United States. And there's these new policies that are coming out in the United States that have an objective in that particular way. And so essentially that's the mitigation, is the effect of effectively per capita, per person in the world, radically reducing the amount of carbon emissions down so that we can actually get to a point where we're not actually warming the planet up as dramatically as it could be feared. The second part is obviously adaptation. And that's going to be more about infrastructure. And there are different sort of strategies for that. You've got the sort of, well, the obvious one would be the kind of the Netherlands example, where you're investing in protecting land. You have, that sort of large scale investments in offshore, effectively reducing flood risk. And that's obviously a lot of concrete, as they say. The other way of doing it would be things like investing in mangrove swamps, or in mangrove planting in places like the Sundarbans in India and Bangladesh, where you're trying to have nature-based solutions, and you're investing in these nature-based solutions to reduce things like flood risk in flood areas. And then you have significant investments in research and development in things like soil science, to reduce the vulnerability of populations in places like sub-Saharan Africa to drought and to food shortages. So we actually increase the yields that are there when you have a warmer climate. So and reducing things like desertification, that sorts of things. So that's the adaptation component of it. And again, that requires significant and larger scale investment. There's also the amount of emissions. So when you have a warmer climate, the nutrients that you're pumping into seas like the Baltic, or for example the Black Sea, they will have much more dire consequences for marine ecosystems there than if it's in a slightly colder climate. And there is also a mitigation requirement there for ensuring that those marine ecosystems are also robust to potential climate change and potential rises in temperature. So those are the sort of the two things that you need to sort of get spending on, really. And then we've got some, that's more or less what we're at. The problem, of course, is you've got to invest in those, and that's the major part. And that means likely you're going to have to borrow money from somebody and then use that money to invest in somewhere else. And for the larger scale things, that's going to be through government expenditure. And that requires you to understand how the future value of those costs are going to be retracting back into your present value.
You mentioned before about how there's expected to be a 4-to-1 return on investment. Over how long? Well,
this is the key mismatch. If we look at a 4-to-1 relationship, that the UN is suggesting that 4-to-1 could be smeared out over 10, 20, 30, and 40 years. And it's unlikely that the rate of return is going to be very immediate. So you're going to be spending a lot of money out before you're returning that money back. And of particular concern is that, which would be a particular concern for investors, is that you're probably going to be investing a lot in low and middle income countries. And therefore, you're going to be demanding a higher risk premium. You're going to be demanding more rates of return. And that's something that you're not going to be seeing immediately. And so that mismatch means that you tend to underinvest. And that's going to be the very difficult part of it, because your returns are going to be much later than the amount by which you're actually discounting those returns into the future. Remember, when you discount something, you're actually saying, I value something in the future less than I value it now. And that's been a really huge discussion in economics in the early 2000s. And you can see on the screen is that we have this sort of the debate that occurred around about 2006-07 between Nicholas Stern and William Nordhaus about how to actually value this. And the Stern review at the time was a very big deal, and I remember when it was a very big deal at the time, and then several American economists came back and said, there's a huge mismatch here. You're saying about all these costs, and you're saying about all these investments will yield all these returns to you. But actually, if you just take a standard savings rate and you apply it to those particular costs, all of the benefits of the radical interventions that you're suggesting basically just go away. And you know, I don't want to be aggressive towards Bill Nordhaus at all, but you know, he's a very influential guy. I mean, he has a Nobel Prize in economics for climate change analysis and research. I should say that there are a lot of people on the more sort of towards the ecology side of economics who view that the rebuttal that he wrote in 2007 to the Stern Review has been a kind of intellectual cushion that's been used, or prop that's been used to justify underinvestment. And I think that's one of the key points, and that's to do with this mismatch between when you get your return and how much risk you're taking in terms of delivery of that money, particularly if you're investing in lower middle income countries. And this has been a bitter argument that I think the low discounters like myself, the people who think that we shouldn't be discounting very aggressively into the future, or certainly if not at all, have actually probably lost. Because I think that if you look at the sort of the standard area in environmental economics, particularly in climate change, you find that it's not going to be well regarded. You know, I can think that, you know, any of my colleagues from economics will be saying, well, you know, you've got to apply a discount rate, and I'm like saying, well, no, I think it can be very, very close to zero, if not equal to zero, and that would then justify you to make these investments. And the only way that you can set that is actually by politics. It's effectively a political decision. It's something that's going to have to be set by the community as a whole, rather than something you should leave to a market to do, which would be terrible, because the market just can't possibly internalize that social cost of carbon for the future outcomes in a way, if left to its own devices. It has to be done it has to be done through some sort of policy. And I think, you know, just to sort of, because it popped up, this recent paper by Sophie Sheave and Margaret Forster, it was kind of very dramatic for me when I read it, because you know, the theory says to you that markets will not price carbon, okay, because it's something that's a future cost, and we won't observe it now in our current valuations. And that's exactly what they found when they looked at companies. They said that private companies reflected the views of people, and they tended to overinvest, relatively speaking, in carbon reductions. But when they became pure market-based public companies, like on a stock market, those gains went away. And that's a very unfortunate conclusion, to show that actually the market really is not capable of actually embedding this cost in there. My colleagues, Laura Marsiliani and Thomas Renström, next week will try and show you mechanisms that attempt to correct markets for that, and show that investors actually can have a say in this. But what we're finding is particularly in the United States, it's just not there. And that what we have is more greenwashing rather than actually real concrete movement of private capital into green projects that actually will then do the things that we just discussed previously.
Is one of the problems with the kind of embedding it into the calculations that you mentioned that it's not just that the benefit is in the future, but that the benefit is at some unknown point in the future?
Oh yes, and we see this both with markets and with policy. We've observed in real time over the last year that often governments have to see something get worse before they'll correct it, rather than preemptively correct it, because the cost of the preemption means that if you then fix something, you can never prove that it was a problem to start off with. So you could imagine spending 1 times global GDP, everything's fine by 2080, and everybody's saying, well, it cost us a lot of money and we didn't get the problems that we were expecting. And that might be the case, but this is a path-dependent problem. There are many pathways to the future, and all of those pathways have high levels of uncertainty, and some of those pathways can be pretty bad, and some of those pathways can be much better. And I don't think we want to gamble the future of civilization on which pathway we just happen to have skipped onto. And that's why I think it's important for us to understand that we do need to make concrete corrective actions, and that we have to be sort of informed that once we've mitigated a risk, it shouldn't be written off as sunk cost investment that we've just chucked away. There's actually a value to the risks that we've actually got rid of. And as the UN would point out, when we invest in these new technologies, when we invest in technologies that reduce carbon emissions and increase resilience, we actually get lots of other benefits, lots of other nice benefits that come out of that as positive externalities. And I think those are the things that would be important to remember. But that's something that we have to embed in attitudes rather than something that's going to be coming out of economics. And economics just reflects, market attitudes and policy attitudes. It can't really sort of shape those underpinning viewpoints. And I think that's why I call it the dismal science. We reflect things. We don't actually really are able to change things in that way. We can tell you the sorts of things you might want to do it, but we're not able to do it that way. Economists like to think that we have answers to everything, but in the reality, we don't. It's actually much more important to understand what political science and technology people do, because technologists change the opportunity set, and political scientists tell everybody how to actually best exploit that, whereas economists will just tell you why it worked and why it didn't work afterwards, 10 or 15 years later.
Well, that's my takeaway point from today, is that economists aren't right about everything. I might put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah, we're right 20 years later.
But so you're saying the dominant paradigm for discount rates is not working. Is there a different way of working out discount rates?
There's, from a sort of practical point of view, if you're talking about stocks and bonds, no. The only thing that you can do is inject either a tax system or a regulatory system that embeds the social cost of carbon into returns. So you actually have carbon taxes, you have cap and trade, and these sorts of things. That has to be globally accepted, not just in Europe or in the United States, but across the world. And that's quite difficult. We have the Paris agreements. We have we have the commitment of parties, 26 now coming up in the UK. But, the ambition there is costly. And as Salam al-Haq, who's from ICAD, who's a good friend of IHRR, pointed out in a newspaper article the other day, we do need to see the money on the ground. Now, from a more theoretical point of view, if you want to sort of go back to the pillow, so Bill Nordhaus gave the fund managers a nice pillow to say, well, you don't need to invest because the discount rates, if you have a savings rate with those long run future impacts, go away. There's an alternative way of looking at things, which is one thing that my former colleague, Joe Swierczynski, was very interested in, which is called hyperbolic discounting. And in hyperbolic discounting, you look at long run costs and you actually value them more highly than you do short run costs. So you discount normally for a very short run, but the long run still has value to you. And the justification for that is that you value the future outcomes more because you intergenerational outcomes. You might have intergenerational transfers. You want to know that your children, your nieces, your nephews, grandchildren, grandnieces, and grandnephews are going to be looked after. That you want to have the longevity of your family is important to you, and they have this overlapping generations model. And then when you average out the how you value future outcomes, you get this what they call a hyperbolic discount curve. That is a controversial but relatively neat way of skipping around the long run problem, because in normal discounting you end up at zero, whereas here you end up with a kind of a flat plane, so you end up valuing those future outcomes more greatly. And that will affect how, and if you can instill that in public policy, just like we do with central banks and their expectations and inflation and things like that, then that there is a reasonable hope that you could shift the major aspects of public investment over to a sort of a more climate-centric view. And it's going to need to be public investment, because public investment is the big part of investment, and that's the block of capital that shifts out at a larger rate. And so that's where we want to be getting to in terms of moving to a higher level of investment in adaptation and mitigation. And I'm hoping that intellectual crutch, or that intellectual pillow, will allow them to sort of sleep at night quite happily, saying, that's why we're investing for multiple generations into the future, and that's why we're not just discounting those risks in 50 or 100 years as being effectively equal to zero, or even in 20 years, to be honest with you, if you take a very high risk investment. So you can imagine an investor looking at a relatively high risk country, places like Argentina have incredibly high discount rates attached to them by international investors. So how are they going to raise half of their GDP for in investments in climate change mitigation for 50 years down the line, when at the discount rates that they're facing, within 10 years any future valuations of costs are equal to zero? They have no impact at all on your current investment strategy, and they just won't be able to do it. And that's something that's important. And we see this gradual shift. We've got this $4 trillion Biden package, which we're starting to get more details on now. And that starts to look more like the kind of numbers that we need. That does look like the sort of things that we need to do. And I think that's an important goal that we want to get to in terms of seeing how we do it. But that relies on the current government in the United States being able to pass that through the Senate, and that's going to be quite a tight thing for them to do. And I think it's that's the other scary part, is just how on a knife edge the decision-making process is at the moment, between going for it and making these investments and trying to get things going at a really large scale level, doing all of this massive infrastructure investment, and or not doing anything and just hoping for the best, which I think is not the right way to go.
Okay, so you do have hope for the future then, with what's happening?
I have hope if Joe Manchin decides to vote the right way, and that Biden can pass a $4 trillion package, because I think if the United States can show leadership in this, other countries will follow. And but I am also concerned about, if we look at what's happening in China, for example, if we look at what's happening across the globe, we are not seeing the levels of reductions in emissions that were there. We're not seeing the levels of investment in adaptation that we would. One of the more sobering bits of sort of anecdotal evidence was from ICAD, from our partners in ICAD, where they were saying that of the money that's given to communities for climate resilience adaptation, only about 10% actually of the money that's invested is getting down to the ground. There's a lot of wastage in there. And so, a lot of the numbers that the UN are promoting are numbers which are based around, effective and efficient investment in infrastructure. And that's the other bit we haven't really spoken about, is that a lot of it's very inefficient. There's a huge amount of middlemen that are there scooping out money at the time. So by the time it gets to communities, a lot of it's actually gone. And so that's
even scarier.
Pardon?
That's even scarier. So politicians don't want to invest because the benefit is at some unknown point in the future. So they struggle with the cost benefit analysis. And then even if they do invest, all the money can be scooped up by middlemen.
Yes.
Lovely. Well, that's inspiring.
I'm not sure if Dr. Huck is actually here, but I mean, one of the reasons I have hope for the future is because of people like Dr. Huck actually making these issues really clear to a broad cross-section of politicians and going into the sort of detail. And I think most people who've got any kind of economics and finance background will immediately understand the critical points. I mean, this is more or less economics 101, but the implications and the interactions with the with the climate modeling work and the need for these sorts of things at a social level I think is not probably fully recognized. And again, that comes back to my economics is a quite cold discipline, and we don't really think about we're not placing ourselves enough in the shoes of the people who will have the consequences imposed upon them. And I think that's something that we do need to sort of think about more. So, this is kind of more of a call to my colleagues in economics to be better at explaining things and to be a bit more outward facing. But it's also a call to sort of to the political class to understand how they need to sort of communicate this more broadly. And for us as individuals, as citizens, to actually then communicate that we want our values reflected in how public finance works. And I think that's something that's important.
Okay, excellent. I think that sounds like a nice point to perhaps open up to questions, if that's okay, Julian.
Sure.
Excellent. Yeah, nice point to end on. We've got a couple come through in the Q&A already. I'll read them out because this is being recorded. Alex Hughes asks, for somebody studying environmental economics and picking a dissertation topic, what areas do you think are particularly interesting to contribute to existing literature? You're serving a useful purpose in answering this question.
I think it depends. It depends on what scale he's interested in. So I'll go for the two scales that I know of. So clearly, willingness to pay and individual choice, the individual consumer choice, is one of the major areas of environmental economics that's very active right now. So, talking to farmers about how they decide on what crops they're growing and these sorts of things, and how they're vulnerable to climate change, and their perception on things like yields and things like that. So that willingness to pay area is really important. And colleagues like Carly and I have two colleagues in IHRR, Rick Scarper and Asha Aftab, who are real experts in the area of this sort of discrete choice modeling. And, so that's one area in terms of sort of looking at discrete choice modeling. The second part, I think, which is at the sort of the grander scale, which is probably a little bit more I sort of sit, because I'm not really an environmental economist, I'm a finance person, is looking at the integrated climate and economics models and trying to improve the use of these integrated climate models. So understanding things like hazard functions, damage functions, and then realizing just how important the discount rate ends up being in almost all of these models, and trying to figure out ways that we can actually get rid of that as an issue. So I think that would be there. And if you want to be a little bit more heterodox, applications of hyperbolic discounting to integrated climate models would probably be a very heterodox thing to do, and you could probably write a good book on that if you I'm sure there's somebody out there who'd really pay for a good book on that, because there's still so much to do on that, and it would be very disruptive to the economic agenda, the conventional classical economics agenda.
Excellent. I will shortly be Googling what heterodox means.
Oh, it just means that you're not popular amongst the classical and the normal economists.
Okay, all right, good to know. Okay, we've got another one from Dragana Marina. I apologize if that was a terrible interpretation of your name. In your opinion, which European countries stand out as leaders in climate change mitigation and adaptation? The Nordics, maybe. That's a good
right, well, so, there are like some cheap answers to say to that. Like, so, so for example, if you look at Norway, they've done particularly well, but obviously that's not including what they produce. You could say Scotland's pretty good at renewables and at climate change mitigation. We are obviously still one of the largest oil exporters in the world. So one has to balance those sorts of things off. Coupled with the fact that we have to remember is, and I don't want to say I'm a sort of huge fan of Greta Thunberg, but she made a very, very salient point, which is that a lot of the times we're looking at carbon reductions in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe, but we're actually forgetting that we've offset a lot of our production to across the world, to India, China, these sorts of places. So, one of the reasons we consume a lot less electricity in the UK these days is that we produce about a third of the amount of aluminium that we used to produce in the 1970s and the 1980s. So we used to produce about 300 million tons of aluminium. Now we only produce about 100 million tons of aluminium. That's an incredibly electrically intensive, carbon intensive manufacturing, also steel. And but it's not that we don't consume as much aluminium anymore, we just get it from somewhere else. And so the supply chain issue complicates things more greatly. And there's a lot of debate in the sort of the environmental accounting kind of literature and the supply chain literature as to how you go about computing those supply chain impacts. And there's been a lot of controversy because there's a lot of greenwashing that's involved. So sometimes you can look at places that look really good and actually, in more detail. And we've had a couple of scandals with airlines, for example, where, not scandals is the wrong word, a couple of issues with airlines where their offsetting methods are just not effective and they're not really doing the offsetting that they're looking at. So, when you see in the airlines is, would you like to offset your flight? It's like that offsetting model, it's not really delivering the level of offset that you're looking for. So I think it's quite tricky for me to give a ranking. Again, it was something that we were asked by the European Commission to do around about 2006, was to give a ranking of climate emissions, and we started to do this job. And then we would say X is good or Y is good, and this is the thing. So, like, Germany looks pretty bad because they are a pretty big emitter. They actually emit quite a lot, but they also are a producer. So the amount of stuff that they're producing there, it might be more reflective of what the UK is. It's just that it's part of the supply chain. And so I'm not going to single out one particular country as being very good or very bad in this, because I think that any rich country has a lot of responsibility to bear, not just as what we're doing now, but what we've done over the previous 200 years. And we bear a responsibility to all the people all over the world, not just to sort of change the rate of what we're doing, but actually to reduce the level. And I think that's the bit where, there's some cost involved that we need to sacrifice a little bit for, because we are living in a wealthy nation that can afford a little bit to support other people across the world.
I like that point. As someone who's done a lot of research on the British Empire, I like this idea about sort of legacies of responsibility. I've got another question from Lena Dominelli. Julian, you know each other. How far do you think the disconnect between economists and communities is critical to the political failure for pressure to go up from the grassroots to the politicians for change? This is certainly becoming more important for younger electorate.
Yeah, as I said, I think that the disappointing thing is that I call it a pillow, because I think it's about how you sleep at night, right? And I think that Bill Nordhaus gave a really good pillow to people who are, to say, well, it's not our problem to value it at this point. Now, I put that as one point as an aside. Sorry, it keeps flicking off, and I want to keep to the previous ones. It's really a big problem. We are not communicating the trade-offs properly. And all that people see is that there's a carbon tax, or there is some kind of passed on cost that we're having to face now, which prevents us from buying something that we like, or it reduces our income. And everybody, I have a good friend of mine, and I'm not going to say his name, but most people around here will know who he is. He is like a really proper hardcore environmental economist. And he's a very, very socially responsible guy, complaining to me about his taxes and potential tax rises the other night. And I said to him, but like, what other taxes needs to go into actually investing in, in environmental areas? And he goes, yeah, I know, but I still don't like paying taxes. So even the people who are well informed on this, like myself, I don't like it when I get my tax statement through. It's going to cost us, and we do have to do it. And I'm not sure how we communicate that well. That's something that's pretty tricky for us to do. And I can't seem to sort of like persuade my family on this. So if I'm not persuasive in my own family, I'm not sure I can. I'm particularly good and persuasive in that way. But we do need to strongly put our view forth that we need to address this situation. I think the analogy we were given the other day in a discussion is like it's revising for an exam. Nobody likes revising for an exam. But in this, I think Carl, you said it. I'm going to copy what you said because it was really good. You worst case scenario, if you don't revise for your exam, you fail. Well, in this case, the worst case scenario, if you don't do something, is that people will die, and lots of people will die. So it's quite, the downside's pretty high. And we do need to sort of invest in this thing, and we do need to do something that's going to actually forgo some of our happiness now in order to actually make sure we've got this investment into the future. And it might have higher risk, and it might not be as good as investing in Bitcoin.
That was fun. Alex says thank you for helping him with his dissertation. It's always a good thing. Julian, while we wait for any more questions to come in, what is the takeaway point that you want people to walk away with on this topic, or come to the next sessions with in their mind?
Yeah, because I did want to spend just 2 minutes just explaining how the finance bits fits together, and there are these 3 extra sessions that come towards the end. So the take home from my case is that is this the urgent need for action, and that it's extremely expensive. The other point about it is not to be lost when you hear X billions is actually being invested. You've got to think about it in the context of that 90 trillion. So, 90 trillion global GDP. Every other number, that's 90,000 billion. So when anybody says we're investing 5 billion, 8 billion, 10 billion, 20 billion, always has to be confirmed next to that. And I think this is something that's, I'm an avid viewer of American news networks, from Fox News to MSNBC. That 4 trillion number that Biden's there, it's a political football, and that's something that we need to show is reflected in our views to the public policy people, to say that we understand the magnitude of this and we're not frightened by the numbers. An investment of £1 billion in 1900 would have been an astronomical sum of money. Okay, but the economy grows over time. So that 90 trillion invested now will be a drop in the ocean in 50 years. So we do need to take into account that the nominal number shouldn't be sort of confused or conflated with the with the relative amount of investment that we have to make.
So that's your takeaway, is that this is urgent and expensive, and we all have to suck it up and deal with it.
a little bit, but it's not like things like this. So the next week, I noticed that Jeff was hi Jeff has also popped the question in. But next week, Laura Marsiliani and Thomas Renstrom will actually talk in inordinate amount of detail about return on investment for environmental and sustainable funds. And we saw last week that ESG funds actually outstripped normal funds for the first time in terms of investment, but that's about 20 to 25 billion in investment. So we're still, we're still in the wrong ballpark from that, but it's a step in the right direction. And they'll also go into an alternative way you can actually go about accounting for the green part in it from a market point of view. And so it's a strongly market point of view. So it sort of runs as a counterpoint to my, if we know we've got to get governments and central banks to sort these things out, and then Laura and Thomas will talk about what the private sector is doing and can do to deliver on that. And then Andy Large is going to speak on the 19th about what it means to be vulnerable, how the investment works in rural communities and in communities that are actually at risk already. And that will talk about our Living Deltas project and how we go about that. So I'll join in for a little bit of that, but it's primarily Andy talking about how we're going to how we show the value of investment in these communities. And then Andrew Wright and Joanna Berry from the Business School are going to talk about the UK, and they're going to talk very much about decarbonisation in the UK and how we go about gritting our teeth and doing things like installing new boilers, electric cars, decarbonisation, offshore wind farms, that sorts of things, and just the sort of the grinding difficulties of getting stuff done in the UK in this particular area. Even when I think of many of the countries of the world, the UK is pretty educated on this area, and whether you're from the right wing to the left wing, there's a general acceptance. We don't have the sort of the permeated climate skepticism that there is in the United States, but it's still very difficult to get things done in that way. But they'll talk about that in this way, and I think that's going to be very interesting too. Was that an answer to Jeff Moore's question? The answer to Jeff Moore's question is let me read it out first, because Jeff. It says typical investment calculations that are being made take account of future costs if present investments are not made. Yes, is the answer to that. Absolutely yes. And that's true. That it's not a sort of it's not, one is not exogenous of the other. The integrated models do all of those sorts of things. What I should point out, though, which I didn't talk about too much in when it popped up, is that one of the big problems with economic models at the moment is they only take the average outcome. And so they only take the average outcome with investment, without investment. And what we should be doing is to take the complete spread of outcomes. But that actually requires a lot of computing time. It takes a lot of computation time. And that requires us to go and beg a favor off of our friends in computational physics and say, can we borrow your supercomputer for 6 months? Because that's going to require us to do quite a lot more complicated calculations than we do if we just take the average. And that's another reason why I sometimes get a bit cynical about economics. We do try to simplify things by assumption and say, well, let's look at the average cost, when we really should be looking at the spread. And there aren't that many models that are fully looking at the spread. There are a few, but they're not as many as we should have. And they should be the mainstream models rather than what we do at the moment, which tends to be the average.
Right, well, that's all the audience questions for the time being, but I have one based on what we talked about in our pre-interview, in our mock green room, which was on your subject of mitigation versus adaptation. How do we know when we've failed and we have to switch from one to the other?
Oh, that's a horrible question, because I said that's quite a difficult thing to do. Yes, indeed. There is so when we're doing these things, we call them dynamic optimizations. And the general feeling at the moment, as my colleagues from geography will tell us, is that we are still in the phase where investing in reduction in carbon emissions will be probably the most effective mechanism of mitigating future outcomes, right? And that will be the most effective protection mechanism. However, as we leave it longer and longer, there will be cases where we have to begin to switch from focusing investment on carbon emissions into actually focusing on infrastructure that's going to be resilient to climate change and actually making communities resilient to the higher levels. Now, I should give a précis here. We can't fully do that. So there will be places in the world where it is effectively impossible for us to fully adapt to climate change at the higher level. So, once we start to talk about that first graph, if we get to the sort of the worst case scenarios outside of the sort of the 1.5 to 2 degree, then there won't be any possibility to do that. We're a bit stuffed in that. There will be permanently changes in the ecosystems and permanent changes in human habitability. The question then comes in is on average for a given pathway, if we're looking at what we're observing in terms of what the climate scientists are telling us is happening, is when do we begin to switch our focus of investment away from decarbonization? And we don't know what those triggers will be at the moment. And there was a couple of really nice pieces of work that were done by Ian Martin from the London School of Economics that looked at coincidental catastrophes over long periods of time. And what it showed was that there's a huge difficulty in understanding when that switch might occur. It's not like we're going to be able to say, well, we've got runaway global warming now and we're here and then we'll just switch. That doesn't work at all. And there's not a sort of a consensus in the literature that tells us what those triggers might be. What we do feel is that, and this is expert led, this is not like there's no definitive single model that tells us this. Absolutely, there's no sort of general relativity model of climate change that allows us to do this. The consensus of experts is decarbonization at the moment by 2030 will be the primary mechanism. If we are still emitting at the current levels or potentially higher after 2030, then we then need to sort of seriously think about refocusing our efforts in terms of that. But that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't just plateau, we shouldn't flatten it out, because we can't just keep going up. Otherwise, we'll end up back at the 65 million years ago where the planet is not hospitable to people. So, there has to be something that's done. We will always need to decarbonize. It's just a question of how aggressively we do it, and we should be aggressively doing it now. Okay. That wasn't really an answer. As I say, it's a really, really hard thing to do. That's because it's a mean question. I said it was a mean question.
It was on my list of things definitely to ask, so possibly it sounds like something you probably flagged to me as a mean question, and I wrote it down.
I think the example that we gave, what we were talking about, was it's sort of like Coronation Street, because things are so gradual that, you know, if you take any given epoch of Coronation Street, it's a long running soap opera. And if you look at two episodes from 1965 and 1967, they look relatively similar, right? The cultures, the classes, the mores, the social dispositions of people are relatively similar. Take 67 to 78, quite different. 78 through to 90, quite different. And that's the problem. The graduation is it's gradual, that we come to accept and adapt and gradually adapt to things at a graduated level, that we actually don't have these significant trigger events that allow us to go, that's the point at which we need to fix it and change it. And that's one of the bigger difficulties as well, because if there was a nice big signal that was generally accepted by everybody, that all of the scientific community could agree on, that would be there. Most, and I say most, I'm talking the vast majority of the science tells us that we need to be decarbonizing now aggressively. And you know, the people who are saying against it are not what I would consider to be the mainstream in the scientific community at all. So, and you know, one would have to look carefully at their motivation before you listen to what they are saying. So
I think
that's that.
The way you've explained it to me before is that we as individuals don't experience climate change quickly. It's very, very slowly. And I think the analogy you used is that we experience climate change like we experience social change.
Yes.
Very slowly. So yeah, you can look back at those 10 years and go, oh yeah, I see what happened there.
Yeah.
In the moment, it is, yeah, very difficult. And yeah, so we're stealing each other's analogies today.
Yeah, exactly. So that I think is the this is where we sit with an experiential part of our lives. In terms of that, we have the immediacy of our pay slips and our taxes and the cost of goods and things like that. And then we have this slow change, which is coming at us, which is quite difficult for us to actually then appreciate and take into account of. And we also only experience one pathway, our own pathway. We're not experiencing the pathways of people living in the Sundarbans. We're not looking at the pathway of people living in the Mekong Delta and these sorts of places. And so those are all sorts of different things. And we also have lots of noise. There are lots more things that happen that are noisy that we can ascribe the issues to. And so that allows us to push to kick that bucket down the road a little bit longer and not actually have to deal with the problem that we actually have.
If you've enjoyed today, you might want to check out the following events. Julian's mentioned them a few times, with Laura Marsiliani and Thomas Renstrom on green investment and private capital. Julian's had a kind of downer on the private sector this week, and then next week they're going to put the pieces back together for you. Then on the 19th of May, there's Andy Large talking about living deltas and what actual good is really happening on the ground to combat issues like flooding, etc., which is inspiring stuff. I'm really looking forward to that one. And then finally, Andrew Wright and Joanna Berry, who'll give us the concluding series in this talk about overcoming the difficulties of infrastructure change. So how do we make those big changes? So keep an eye out for those emails circulating to register for those events. Thank you very much for joining us and for your questions.